should try Olipop. That's a good one.
It's got sugar in it.
Yeah, it's like it's a probiotic soda. I've heard of this. Okay. Olipop.
The Greek place downtown, Yamas, they have it.
I like that.
I like Yamas. I haven't eaten there in at least a week. I need to go there again.
Yamas or Cova?
I haven't been to Cava. Well, I've been to a Cava. There's one in Charlotte. It's a little out of my usual lunchtime price range.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
I like Yamas because Yamas is basically Mediterranean Chipotle.
Yeah, it is.
Only better.
They have really good flavor.
I do like their falafel. Now the best falafel I've ever had, this is this little place. So first you go to Bethlehem, and it's right on the edge of Bethlehem overlooking the village of Beit Zahor, where the shepherd's field was, and it's a tent. And you sit on couches, and they'll bring you falafel and kibbeh and a hookah, and there's lots of pictures of me smoking hookah on a couch in a tent in literally Bethlehem. Best place to get falafel I've ever had it. They're in Jericho. There was a good place in Jericho that had falafel, and I rode a camel.
Did you? How was that?
It was fun.
It was fun.
Super touristy, but a good area.
Yeah, I was so scared because it's cold.
They are, but they're also extremely docile. And they'll get them to kneel down so that you can climb up on it, and then they stand up.
Fourth grader, because you have to have first to be in there. Yeah.
Only like the numbers and first graders were fine. I can't find numbers.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We prayed vespers to start with, which is opportune because that's going to be one of the big things we talk about. So to recap from last time, we're going through the history of Marian devotion, which means that in order to do that, we have to talk about church history. So this is a class on church history masquerading as a class on Marian devotion. I will do that a lot in Advent when I do my infancy narrative series. That's actually a series on how to interpret the Bible that is masquerading as a series of reflections for Advent. But if I can kill two birds with one stone, I figure I'm giving you your money's worth in these free talks. So you should ask for a refund. I think there's an episode of the Muppet Show where Steve Martin is like auditioning with the Muppets, and they said, so he asks them like how much did you pay to get in here? And they said nothing. He said you should get your money back. Yeah. So maybe not church history broadly speaking, but what we're talking about is kind of how the church reckons the periods of her history. And there are very definite dividing points, and it's a good way of thinking about the fact that just in general, when we talk about history, we divide these things up sort of artificially. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, we're in the Middle Ages now. Though, as I said last time, I actually would posit that there was somebody who woke up one morning and kind of invented the Middle Ages, and that was St. Gregory the Great. I think that Benedict and Gregory form a tandem that takes us out of the patristic period into the medieval. And the reason I say that, as I said last time, the apostolic age is the period where the apostles are actually out there doing their thing. They're out there being apostles. They're going out there being sent out, which is what apostello means. It's what an apostle is. So this is the period in which between the resurrection and ascension of Jesus in the year 33 up to the death of John. And the patristic period begins when John dies, because it's now the church, the people we call the church fathers are in charge of the church. When that ends it depends on who you ask. There are some people who even include Bernard of Clairvaux among the church fathers, even though he lived in the 11th century. I think that's way too late. I think John Damascene, who's in the 7th century, is probably better. And I think the reason that we would divide the history like that, again, we have a definite point here. There's a theological reason why the apostolic age is there. It's because public revelation ends when John dies, because there's now no more apostles to tell us what Jesus said. So public revelation is here, so that's a good cutting off point, not just in time, but in our ecclesiology. The patristic period, I think we cut it off either when do we consider the period that the church's influence begins to be sort of unfettered by persecution, unfettered by the societal conditions that kind of make this what it is. If you go back and you study the fathers, about every third one is a martyr on average. And if you study the first half of the patristic period, about 80% of them are martyrs. Justin, martyr, among them, one of the very early ones. Irenaeus of Lyon is a martyr. Ignatius of Antioch. The bulk of the writing we have from Ignatius is letters he was writing to the various churches on his way from Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. Anytime you don't know where somewhere in classical antiquity or in the biblical period is at, chances are it's in Turkey. Cappadocia is in Turkey. Antioch is in Pisidia, which is in Turkey. St. Nicholas of Myra, who is also known as St. Nicholas of Bari. Bari is in Italy, but Myra in Lycia is in Turkey because St. Nicholas was the bishop of Myra in Lycia, and after he died, pirates stole his bones and took them to Bari. This is a recurring theme in church history, that pirates take holy people and holy things and put them places they're not supposed to be. Happened to St. Vincent de Paul twice. He was abducted by pirates on multiple occasions. But anyway.
To sell?
What's that?
To sell?
Yeah, they would like sell them into slavery in North Africa.
Oh, I thought you meant the boat.
No, Vincent de Paul was abducted while he was still alive by pirates. So, but anyway, we're not talking about pirates. We're talking about the patristic period. So a lot of martyrs, very bloody period in the church's history, because there was a concept of eius regio, cuius religio. In other words, he who rules, it is his religion. And so the Roman Empire bounced back and forth between being mildly tolerant of Christianity, being super supportive of Christianity, or persecuting Christians. And this happens in a lot of places. In Japan, this is how kind of Japanese history works vis-a-vis Christianity. That the movie Silence that came out a few years ago by Martin Scorsese, where Martin Scorsese directs Liam Neeson, Andrew Garfield, and Adam Driver. Basically, Qui-Gon Jinn has become a Jesuit and has been abducted by the Japanese, and Spider-Man and Kylo Ren have to go back into Japan to find him. And it's I haven't seen the movie, I've read the novel, and the novel is one of the most shocking things I've ever read in my life. But it's set in a time when the Catholic-friendly warlord in Japan has just been deposed, and a Buddhist warlord has been installed as the leader, has taken over as leader, because Japan, for most of its early modern history, was basically gang warfare between the different factions, the different clans fighting for control. And so basically a Buddhist warlord had taken over who was not favorable to the Portuguese and to the Catholics. The Jesuits are expelled, and they start torturing Catholics, and particularly the clergy. So in this period, the Roman Empire bounces back and forth, even with the vision of Constantine in 313, where Constantine then issues the Edict of Toleration, which will allow for Christianity to just sort of exist in the Roman Empire. It'll be another roughly century before Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire, and that isn't even a permanent change. So this is a very unstable time. Interestingly, this is one of the most fruitful times in the church's history. There is a saying from the church father Tertullian, who is not a saint because there was some of what he wrote that was a little bit questionable, but Tertullian says that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, and this period is proof of that because the bulk of how we think about our faith comes from this time. That you could probably argue that Christian theology is a series of footnotes to the patristic period. And this is borne out by the fact that the medieval theological tradition is a series of reflections on both Scripture and the things that the fathers are writing. St. Thomas Aquinas sources Aristotle more than anybody else, but then after Aristotle, St. Augustine, who was one of the most prolific church fathers, Gregory the Great, and the Pseudo-Dionysius. I've always said that I'll give a confirmation kid $20 if he'll take the name Pseudo-Dionysius. Who wasn't really Dionysius, who lived in the Apostolic Age. He was actually a Platonist philosopher who lived about 600, but anyway. Today we're talking about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and as I said, the Middle Ages, it wasn't as though everybody flipped their calendar over and said, oh, we're in the Middle Ages. But I think there are some definite markers, and one of the big things is the Roman Empire falls in 476. So a lot of secular historians will say the Middle Ages begin in 476. And I think that's the first kind of major societal factor. Then you have, I would say, Saint Benedict in the 6th century represents something of a John the Baptist kind of figure that stands on the edge of the patristic period leading into the medieval. And I would say that what Benedict does is more medieval than it is patristic, because by now Benedict is being influenced by figures from the patristic period who've already been practicing monasticism for 400 years in a form that would be at least somewhat recognizable to us. He distills what they have done, he synthesizes what they've done, and comes up with his rule for monasteries, because a lot of the rules that had come before were very strict and very burdensome. Benedict wanted something that was more practicable and more accessible, and basically emphasizes all throughout the rule that the rule isn't meant to be some special extra thing. It is just sort of Christianity kind of taken to its logical conclusion. In the East, there's a better concept of this, I think, in the idea that all Christians are called to be monastic and some are called to be more monastic than others. That lay people are not a different sort of class of Christians. It's in the West, I think, as we like to make distinctions and we like hierarchies, we think of the monastic life, and particularly the really contemplative monastics, as sort of being the special forces, and everybody else is kind of the foot soldiers. Whereas in the East, the idea is everybody is the special forces because we're all Christian, that Jesus didn't set up a two-tiered system. And some people are called to live that out in terms of a deeper sacrifice, but it's really just this, the monastic life is Christianity, that it's this continuum of living a life that is attached only to God, that regularly devotes itself to God. And that's very important because, again, that's going to color what does medieval Christianity look like. The monastery becomes sort of the stable center in the localities where they're set up for prayer and for learning. That many of the medieval universities are built around monasteries. In this country, that is actually how Catholicism spreads, is the Benedictines come over here and they start founding monasteries. And one of them, of course, just up the road, the reason we are sitting here in a Catholic church right now is that in 1876, a monk and two students got off a train in Garibaldi, North Carolina, which was later renamed Belmont, and they walked a mile up to this big field, and they sat down in the big field and had class, and the next day they set to work building a monastery at a college, where I graduated from in 2010, and I've long said that I'm a little skeptical about donating to them because I see what they do with money, and one of the things they do with money is to hire me to teach theology to nursing students, so my skepticism only grows. So in terms of Marian devotion, this is actually going to be a big influence now that we've kind of settled. I would say Benedict is kind of the beginning of a tandem that then ends with Gregory. Gregory is the one who sort of brings the church out of the patristic period and makes it this force for the culture in the Middle Ages. That it is Gregory who really shapes the church into what it will be for the next really 14 centuries. And his papacy is quite important because he basically increases, we'd say, the prestige of the church. That we've come out of a period where, so the Roman Empire has fallen, and so the Western world is actually not as stable anymore now that you don't have this big unifying force, so the church steps in to fill that vacuum. And for much of history, and it's not to say this is just this perfect golden age where everything was wonderful, there were still wars and divisions and all kinds of other issues, but the church becomes what the Roman Empire had been, which was this sort of stable force for kind of uniting everybody and kind of connecting everybody. Even things like banking becomes a thing in the Middle Ages with the Knights Templar. That is, this is a Christian organization. This is a knighthood, an order of knighthood, a chivalric order within the church. And one of the things they did was you could deposit your money in France, and then when you got to Jerusalem on the crusade, you could take your money back out. And so they have this way of connecting all this long before there is anything approaching what we have in the present day. There are going to be three main facets of Marian devotion, turning now to the thing we're particularly focused on in the Middle Ages. One is going to be books of hours. Also the little office. The rosary begins in this period. And then monastic hymns. So in both the East and the West, and I think I alluded to this last time, a lot of popular prayer, a lot of the prayer that people are doing arises out of liturgical and monastic prayer. That people looked and they said, this is what the church is doing, so I'm just going to do that at home. Or I'm going to kind of do that on my own time. It also goes the other way, that popular devotion sort of influences liturgical practice, that the church is sort of responsive to what do people want to celebrate, what's really edifying for them. This is why we have the concept of a votive mass. That a votive mass is when you celebrate some feast or some aspect of the life of Jesus, not on its actual day. So historically, traditionally, for many centuries, celebrating a votive mass on Saturday in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary is one of those things. And it's because people were devoted to Mary. Saturday became a day that was sort of associated with the devotion to Mary, and so the church responds to this by enshrining that in the liturgy. The Mass is going to be the place where you see that show up more, but the Divine Office, because it was a monastic practice in the West for pretty much all of its history, stays more stable, because the name of the game, if you're in a monastery, is doing the same thing every day pretty much the same way. And stability is one of the things that Benedict vows his monks to. And so the little office and the books of hours are going to be where we see Marian devotion show up, because these are sort of that divine office, that what we now call the liturgy of the hours, the regular praying of the psalms at different intervals of the day. These are sort of lay versions of them, or reduced versions of them. The book of hours would have just contained the prayers of the office, but they were usually quite sumptuously decorated. You go to museums and you see these, they were usually commissioned by wealthy patrons for their use, but they tended to have a lot of beautiful decoration and beautiful imagery, particularly of Mary. The little office arises from a time when you actually did have a two-tiered system in the monastic life. After a couple of centuries of monastic life being lived in the West under the rule of Benedict, you start to develop this sort of hierarchical structure in the monastery. You have the solemnly professed monks who were all addressed as father, whether they were priests or not. And they had the obligation of praying the divine office. Remember that office comes from a Latin word that doesn't mean the place where I sit and pretend to work for 4 or 5 hours a day. It means a responsibility. And so they have the responsibility, they have the vow of praying these hours of prayer. And so the solemnly professed monks are vowed to the whole office, to the whole responsibility. The lay brothers, and this kind of tiered monastic life existed for roughly 1,000 years or so in those places. And then after Vatican II, this is done away with. And I think quite rightly, because Benedict didn't want there to be sort of, different levels of monks, basically. But the lay brothers would be ones that were, many times they were not literate, and they would be the solemnly professed monks. They would devote themselves mostly to the divine office, but they also would be the ones engaged in intellectual pursuits. They're teaching, they're studying, they're writing. The lay brothers would be doing all manual labor. And this is why this ends up being a little bit of a problem that needs to be addressed, because again, Benedict makes it sound like everybody needs to share equally in especially that part of the monastic life. But the little office was for the lay brothers. It was a much reduced form, because they're not going to be able to pray the full divine office, because they're really busy working the farm and building things and bringing in water and things like that. So they pray a reduced version of the office. They aren't allowed into the choir stall. So the solemnly professed monks are also called choir monks, because they're allowed into the choir, and they practice the office, at these different intervals. There's 8 offices that they were responsible for. The little office would just contain like morning and evening prayer, basically. In many places it was done in the vernacular, because again, you're talking about monks who are not quite as learned. The choir monks are praying their office in Latin, but the lay brothers would just be doing it in whatever vernacular. There are very early vernacular versions of this. What that grew into was this became a way for lay people to kind of be tapped into the life of the monastery if they had access to a book like this. And it grew into this devotional office that can be prayed by the laity, and this exists both in the pre-Vatican II version of the Divine Office and the post-Vatican II version. And what it was is they just compiled the texts of the Divine Office from different Marian feasts. And so like on Sunday you're praying one feast, on Monday you're praying another feast, but it was basically just morning and evening prayer taken from those different feasts. So a reduced version of the Divine Office, but it's a great way to like learn the rhythm of it. So you can buy a little book that has the little office in it. And just, it's a great way, like I say, it's a good introduction. If you want a really, really soft introduction to the Liturgy of the Hours, this is a great way to do it. So it grew into something that was done devotionally, that by people who didn't have the obligation to pray the office, but in particular focusing on Mary. There is a bit of a history of other devotional little offices. Some of them involve praying the Psalms, just like the little office would, just like the big office would, you know. Some of them involve just prayers prayed at regular intervals that maybe don't involve the Psalms, maybe other scriptural texts or things like that. I think there's like a little office of the Holy Face that I don't think has the Psalms in it. It just had little prayers. But through the Middle Ages, this is a fairly common thing that the laity would look and see, okay, the monks are doing this thing that takes up like half their day. We don't have time for that. We want to pray like monks. So these sort of reduced offices come about. And the most popular and widespread, and probably the most enduring one, because like I say, there is a post-Vatican II version of this. So even to this day, this is still something you can do, is the one that is dedicated to Mary. So books of hours, I think, probably are more, in terms of Marian devotion, it does follow the divine office, but it was more the fact that there was a lot of very beautiful art, very beautiful devotional art in the hands of many of the laity, particularly the affluent. But then the little office comes about as a way that people can kind of be tapped into the rhythm of prayer of the monastery. The rosary actually originates in that way. So the rosary, prayer robes have been used for many centuries up to this period. I carry a Byzantine prayer robe, which has 100 knots on it. According to legend, St. Anthony goes out into the desert and he wants to pray, Lord have mercy, 1,000 times a day. And he tries to keep count by throwing pebbles in a bowl. But the problem is, one, you lose count pretty easily, and two, you can't carry that around when you have to go to the oasis in the Egyptian desert to get water or to forage for plants. So he wanted something he could carry with him, so he got a leather cord. And he tied a knot in it every time he prayed, Lord have mercy, but the devil would come along when he wasn't looking and untie the knots. So in a dream, this is a legend, and so this may have happened, I don't know. But in a dream, Mary showed him a knot to tie, that as you tie it, it makes the sign of the cross 3 times, and the devil cannot defeat the cross. And so the knots stay tied. So this one's 100 knot. Some monastics will have 1,000 knot one. In the Russian tradition, the Russian monastic tradition, there actually grew up the custom of, if you're sitting in your cell, so Eastern monasticism is more, monks would live together in colonies of hermits. That they might get together, they would get together once a week on Sunday for the Divine Liturgy. They would pray the Divine Office together, morning and evening. But other than that, they just lived in a little cabin by themselves. There's actually a Russian Orthodox monastery up in West Virginia where that's exactly how it's set up. It's just this little, it looks like a basically a Russian Orthodox scout camp, basically. There's just these little cabins everywhere, and then there's this church kind of down at the end of the valley. And so you could be sitting in your cabin, in your little cell, wrapped in prayer, and miss the divine office. And so your spiritual father was allowed to commute your sort of obligation to praying the Jesus prayer, is what they pray, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, to praying the Jesus prayer like a certain number of times. So I think in the Russian tradition, something like you can pray it 5,000 times to replace matins, the early morning prayer, and you can do, I think, 3,000 to replace vespers or something. And the idea was that occasionally a monk was going to be just really drawn into praying in that way and wasn't going to be able to attend to the office, so this kind of takes its place. Bearing in mind, of course, that in Eastern Christianity and Orthodoxy and Eastern Catholicism, there is a far less strict sense of obligation. That, as I say, that Eastern canon law is a little bit more like the pirate code, as Pirates of the Caribbean would have it. It's more suggestions. And I have Eastern friends who would back me up on that. So the prayer robe forms the basis of the rosary. Somewhere around the 8th or 9th century, the earliest Western form of this is what's called the Paternoster cord. And it's called that because a Paternoster means our Father. And what would happen is the laity would attend services in the monastic church, and they wanted to follow along, but they couldn't read the Psalter because many of them were not literate. So they would pray 150 Our Fathers, because there's 150 Psalms. One of the things St. Benedict insists on in the Divine Office, he gives Benedict, to tell you how much Benedict cared about the monks praying the Divine Office and that kind of being their first job. First off, he said, let nothing be put before the work of God, and the work of God is the Divine Office. There's 73 chapters in the rule, and 12 of them are about how to lay out the divine office, like how many hours there are, what you do at each of those hours, what time of day you do them, how that schedule shifts in the wintertime, because you don't have electric lights, so you got to do things when there's daylight. So out of 73 chapters, he devotes fully a dozen of them to how to pray the divine office. But Benedict says in there at the end of the section on how to pray the divine office, he says, I've told you what psalms to pray at what times and all that, and this is a really good way to do it. He said, do it however works for your monastery, but one principle has to be borne in mind. You have to pray all the psalms in the course of the week. Because he says that if our fathers who went out into the desert could pray 150 psalms in a day, how weak are we that we need 7 days to do it? But let's at least keep to that. And so the monks were praying 150 psalms throughout the course of the week, and to try to follow along with that, the people would take their cord with 150 knots on it and pray a Paternoster, an Our Father, on each knot. So that's why there are 150 Hail Marys in the Rosary, with a little asterisk there. I'll talk about the luminous mysteries in a second. But that was then that had kind of attached to it different meditations on aspects of the life of Jesus. And there were different versions of it at different points in history. The Franciscans had their own kind of version of it. There's the Chapel of the Seven Sorrows has different focuses on these things. But there are 150 Paternosters on the Paternoster cord. That gets turned into the 150 Hail Marys, the 15 mysteries that are then associated with those. In 2002, Pope John Paul II proposes the luminous mysteries. Something like that had actually been in circulation for quite a while. There was a priest, I believe, from Poland, because John Paul II's papacy was a pipeline of great devotional things from Poland being brought to the broader world. Thank you, St. Faustina. But I believe it was a priest from Poland had proposed like another set of mysteries, because there seemed to be a little bit of a gap, because we go straight from the finding in the temple to the beginning of the Passion. And so there's a lot of other things Jesus said and did in there that are worth meditating on. So John Paul II proposes the luminous mysteries to bridge that gap. And I forget which priest, again, there was some devotional writer that had proposed something like this, but he had a different, like two of them were kind of different. But I remember reading a comment that there was somebody who was sort of angry about John Paul II presuming to add to the Rosary, and said if he wants to propose 5 new mysteries, he needs to write 50 more psalms. I don't necessarily agree with that, but again, to show you where that numbering comes from, this is an area where liturgy actually influences devotion. So, like I say, it can go both ways. Devotion can then, kind of go back and influence liturgy in terms of what are people sort of drawn to and what's edifying to them. It can also go the other way, where the liturgy contained 150 psalms that were prayed throughout the course of the week by the monks, and to keep up with that, people had a cord with 150 knots, which then turns into our 150 Hail Mary 15-decade rosary. I do have a soft spot for the luminous mysteries because I was baptized on the Feast of the Transfiguration, and Mount Tabor is one of my favorite places to visit. It is an extremely steep mountain. Like when you read the gospel story of it, it is pretty obvious as to why Peter is probably a little oxygen deprived and saying dumb things. Although he says dumb things when he's at sea level too. But when you go there, you actually can't take a bus to the top because there's 18 switchbacks on the road going up the side of the mountain, and they are 180 turns. I mean, and so you have to get off at there's like a little tourist shop, little convenience store and snack bar, and then they've got all the chintzy like touristy goods there. You can buy your Palestinian scarves and your brassware and your olive wood rosaries like they have at every single other tourist shop in the country. But you stop there, and then cabs will come by, vans that seat about 9 people about every 10 minutes or so. And 9 people pile out, 9 more people pile on, and then you zigzag up the face of the mountain. And then you're up there, you're pretty high up, and you're looking down. There's like an overlook on the backside of the church where you're looking down on all of that end of you're kind of in northern Israel at that point. And you can see for miles. I don't think that's the place. I think it wasn't Tabor. There's another place. It was when we were on Mukhaka. Mukhaka is the site where Elijah slew the prophets of Baal, and that also is on a high mountain overlook. And you can actually look down and see an Israeli air base. And we were watching airplanes take off and land and then go into an underground hangar. So probably an Israeli air base where not so public things were happening. All right. One other note about the books of hours. That a lot of times too, they would have other things in them than just the office. They would have maybe the text of the Mass. They would have other liturgical texts in them to make it so that the laity could kind of participate in the life of the church while at home. Sometimes they'd even have little like catechetical things. It's a little bit like a hand missal now would be, but they were centered more around the divine office than they were the Mass itself. Nowadays, we live in a world where if you want all your liturgical books, you have to buy individual books for individual sacraments, and they're all like $50 a piece, and the art is terrible. It's like beige and sort of like faded purple, like rubber stamp looking things from the early 70s, and it's not terribly inspiring, and it looks like somebody spilled prune juice on your liturgical book. Whereas it used to be, you could get one book for about $80 that had every single one of the sacraments in it. And in some countries you can. I have a book in French that has the rites of all the sacraments, and the installation of acolytes and lectors, and the blessing of an abbot and an abbess, it even includes the ordination rites. And it's one little book about this big. But in the United States, if you want all your sacraments, you've got to pay $40 a volume for individual books, and it's a huge pain. So when I become Pope, God forbid, the first thing I'm going to do is to excommunicate Catholic Book Publishing Company and reinstate exile as a canonical penalty. Exile them to Siberia. And require them to hand copy liturgical books for my use.
But after the Holy Spirit comes upon you, you will not do that.
The Holy Spirit has come upon me 4 times already, and I still want to do that. So. Baptism, confirmation, diaconate, and priesthood. So yeah, we've been there and we've done that.
Takes a bit of time.
Papacy isn't a sacrament though, so I don't see what gears would get shifted there.
Well, I heard on Pope Francis, he was, what was it? He was very uncomfortable, shy, and he felt as soon as he became Pope, a transformation. Yeah.
I've seen it happen in seminary that a guy that you couldn't stand would come back after he got ordained to the diaconate and suddenly was a very different person. I've also seen somebody who was completely insufferable as a seminarian once they were ordained to the diaconate and could no longer be kicked out of seminary short of committing a violent felony, became even more insufferable now that they were untouchable for the next year. So we're still human. I mentioned monastic hymns, monastic chants. That's where we get a lot of the Latinarian hymns that we commonly recite to this day. The Salve Regina comes out of this period as a monastic hymn to Mary. I believe Bernard of Clairvaux wrote it, if I'm remembering right. I've got a monastic breviary in my office that actually tells all of the Marian antiphons that are used throughout the year and who wrote them. There are 4 main Marian antiphons that are done at different points through the year: Advent and Christmas is the Alma Redemptoris Mater, Hail Redeeming Mother, or Hail Mother of the Redeemer, Alma Redemptoris Mater. The tune for it is a little hard to wrap your vocal cords around, particularly if your natural range is as low as mine is, because you have to immediately jump up about 3 steps, the first 3 notes. Then from the Christmas season historically ended on the 2nd of February with the Feast of the Presentation 40 days after Christmas, because we like 40-day periods of celebration. Then from the 2nd of February until the beginning of Lent, or no, the 2nd of February until Easter, rather, would be the Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen. Then from Easter to Pentecost is going to be the, wait a minute, I'm wrong. It's the Ave Regina Shalom. which is Hail, Queen of the Heavens. From Easter to Pentecost is the Regina Caeli, which is one of the reasons I wake up every morning and thank God that he gave us ecclesiastical pronunciation and not classical pronunciation in Latin, because I would feel really silly if I had to sing Regina Caeli, Laetare, Alleluia. And then from Pentecost to the beginning of Advent is the Salve Regina. So it's been a long day. I've done a lot of things. I had an appointment at 11 that didn't begin until 11:05, and then it promptly ended at 11:15 when I got called to the hospital. So it's been one of those kind of days. As I said, Bernard of Clairvaux is hugely influential on the rise of Marian devotion in this period. In the 11th century, Bernard is active. Bernard is mainly known for being a monastic reformer, and also for preaching the First Crusade. He got up and he encouraged the nobles of Europe to send their fighting men to go defend the pilgrimage routes in Jerusalem. Our record in the Crusades ended at 3, 5, and 2. In the 3 of them we won, 5 of them were probably not a great idea, and 2 of them were at best a draw. So after that, the Catholic Church switched to college basketball, and we have never looked back. There are a lot of pilgrimages starting in about the 11th and 12th century. You start to see pilgrimages to Marian shrines as devotion grows up in that way. In the 14th century, Mary is invoked as a protector against the Black Death. So a lot of the Marian devotion that we now hold dear has existed for roughly 700 years, because 700 years ago, that was the thing on a lot of people's minds. That actually had a huge influence, not just on culture and on society, on populations, on the way just life was lived, but the life of the church actually. A lot of our kind of prayers surrounding death and dying really grow up in this period. The dance of death becomes a popular motif in art. Vestments with skeletons on them become a little bit more common. So if you want some funeral vestments that look like pirate flags, I know I do, that you would see that. But this is also where a lot of the titles, some of these titles are very ancient, that they're found in ancient texts going back to the 2nd and 3rd century, where Mary is invoked as health of the sick. Mary is invoked for her protection, but there becomes a special focus on this during the Black Death. St. Bernard, again, prolific preacher, one of his sermons, he writes, "When the storms of temptation burst upon you, when you see yourself driven upon the rocks of tribulation, look at the star, call upon Mary. When swallowed by pride or ambition or hatred or jealousy, look at the star, call upon Mary. Should anger or avarice or fleshly desire violently assail the frail vessel of your soul, look at the star, call upon Mary. If troubled on account of the heinousness of your sins, distressed at the filthy state of your conscience, and terrified at the thought of the awful judgment to come, you are beginning to sink into the bottomless gulf of sadness and be swallowed in the abyss of despair, then think of Mary. In dangers and doubts and difficulties, think of Mary, call upon Mary. Let not her name leave thy lips, never suffer it to leave your heart." So that's a smattering, a sampling of the Middle Ages and kind of devotion to Mary in that time. If I ever do this series again, I'm going to do a PowerPoint, as much as I loathe PowerPoint, so that I can have some visuals for the things I'm talking about here, because it'd be nice to have all this art I'm talking about, and the other various things, texts and things. So now we're going to shift and look at the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Renaissance, one of the first things we think about when we think of Marian devotion in that period is art, because one of the first things we think about in general when we think about the Renaissance is art. I say this looking at a piece of Renaissance art on the other side of the room that is the apostles at Pentecost, and look who's right there in the middle, because Mary was with them, and is usually depicted in art as kind of being in the middle because she's the queen of the apostles, is one of her more ancient titles. There was a lot of art being done by, again, very wealthy people, commissioning works of art, and a lot of times they would commission them for churches, because this was a sign of prestige. This was how you showed off your money, and then you showed off how much you cared about the church was you donated sumptuous art to the church. I don't think there's a problem with that to some extent. I think that, you know, that's how we end up with some of the most priceless treasures of art in civilization. Some of the most influential pieces of art end up in the possession of the church, where then they can be displayed and enjoyed for generations. There's that trope about why don't we sell everything and give it to the poor, and the answer is that you sell everything and you would feed the poor for about 10 minutes, and then you'd be back to square one, and all the great priceless art treasures of the world would be in private collections where you may not be able to see them. But the fact that there is a value to these, there's a transcendent value to this beauty, even being out there where people can be influenced by it. Another kind of answer I usually have to people saying that is, if you want to see what the poor do, you can take a little drive. It's not too far north of here in Roanoke, Virginia. You go right in the middle of downtown Roanoke, and there are two very imposing structures that you can't help but see as you're driving the 581 loop through the middle of Roanoke. One of them is the Hotel Roanoke, which is this big kind of mock Tudor, like lodge sort of structure, very old hotel, kind of prestigious, kind of expensive. Across the street is St. Andrew's Church. St. Andrew's is this absolute gem of a Gothic church. One of the most medieval-looking structures in Western Virginia. I grew up about a little over an hour from Roanoke, so been there several times. And I've been to Roanoke dozens of times. I've been to that church several times. And one of the most beautiful churches you'll see in that end of the state. It was built by poor Irish immigrants. They were railroad workers, because Roanoke is a railroad town. The hub of the Norfolk Southern, then Norfolk and Western, and also the Southern and the Virginian was kind of right there. And Norfolk and Southern maintained their shops there until about 5 or 6 years ago when they closed that, and then somebody else bought it. It's still a railroad shop. So you had all these Irish rail workers, and they wanted to worship in a worthy structure. They're all poor. They're all making absolute, dirt wages. They're living in, shacks, and they had been worshiping in a rail car. They would have mass in like a box car, where they'd set up an altar inside a box car, and then they'd gather around it. And they wanted to build something that was sort of a worthy structure, and they built that. So if you go ask poor people, what do they do with the money when it comes to things like that, they're going to build very beautiful, edifying kinds of things. And even there was even a sense, and particularly up until the modern period, when buildings were not easy to build, that you might be a stonemason cutting stone on the facade of a cathedral, and you're going to die 200 years before this is ever finished. That's certainly the case. There is still one church in progress in the world like that, and that's the Church of Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. That Salvador Dali, if Dali had done the Sagrada Familia, that would have been awesome and crazy, and I would never want to say mass there. Antoni Gaudí is the one who builds that, and he died 50-something years ago, 60 years ago, or maybe longer than that. But Gaudí died long before he could see this completed, and it was being built according to medieval methods of building these things. There were stonemasons. There's actually a story of when I was in seminary, we had in our modern church history class, we watched a documentary on this. They interviewed this stonemason from Japan, who he was one of the last, kind of last of a dying breed of stonemasons that still did that kind of work. Hardly anybody does that kind of work anymore, because everything now is just poured concrete and things like that, kind of prefab things. But he was actually a stonecutter, and he comes to work on the project, and he ended up converting to Catholicism. He was Buddhist, and he became Catholic, and which is not an easy switch in terms of, because you were looking, you could not have two more different ways of looking at the world in terms of just like the overall sort of structures of thought. He became Catholic, and he said he became Catholic because he knew that he wasn't going to be able to really devote himself to this work unless he believed the right things about it. That he could not, basically he just couldn't do his job unless he was Catholic. And so he became a Catholic, and he also acknowledged, he said, I may never see my work finished because of what a momentous project this is. So there was some sense of that. But anyway, I've gotten off track. So the Renaissance, we have a lot of this art being commissioned. There's a lot of the art coming out of the Renaissance that, of course, depicts Mary by various artists. A lot of scriptural scenes are going to be very common motifs. And again, we have Pentecost over here in our this room we call the upper room, which I'm tempted to call the overpass, but but it's been called the upper room since time immemorial, aka like what, 2005 or whatever. It's better than what we call the little. It's better than what we call the yard back here where the kids play. They call it the grassy knoll, and I'm like, because no one apparently remembers that's a little bit of American Catholic history there, and not in a good way, because the grassy knoll is that place where there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas, where Kennedy was shot. So I don't know why people call that, but anyway, I've also threatened to fence it and make it a cow pasture so that the students can engage in manual labor as part of their education. Because again, I want to turn everything into a small 13th century Benedictine monastery. So the kids have to come in from milking the cows to pray matins when they get here for school at 5:30 in the morning. But say suddenly our school budget has tanked because nobody wants to send their kids to a small 13th century Benedictine monastery. They're walking around singing the Dies Irae to do themselves in the head with boards. Anyway, one of the things that begins to happen after this period, though, and maybe kind of in this period, is the Reformation happens around the same time, like kind of as the Renaissance is sort of kicking into gear. The Protestant Reformation comes along and we see some decline in Marian devotion because Marian devotion is seen as something that sort of needs to be reformed and in some cases kind of kicked out altogether. There are objections beginning to arise to the veneration and the intercession of the saints by some of the Protestant reformers. Not necessarily the reformers themselves or the chief reformers, but definitely later on, later generations, and of course that thing gets taken to what you might call logical extremes, and they say that Marian devotion is bad and evil and you shouldn't ever do it. In my previous talk, we went into kind of the apologetics for how do you address the fact that we do venerate Mary, and there's nothing wrong with that, and it's been going on since literally when Jesus was still alive. Martin Luther wrote warmly of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The Magnificat, so the Canticle of Mary that we recite at evening prayer, my soul magnifies the Lord, from Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, starting in verse 46, is actually still a part of Lutheran liturgical life. Martin Luther wrote a commentary on the Magnificat, and he held to all of the defined Marian dogmas that had been taught up to that point. He actually believed in the Immaculate Conception, which wouldn't be formally defined for another 300 years. He wrote poems that praise Mary and her role in salvation history. Luther also wrote polemically of devotion to the saints and seeking their intercession. He said, and I quote, "Furthermore, how will you endure the Romanists' terrible idolatries? It was not enough that they venerated the saints and praised God in them, but they actually made them into gods." Which he was an Augustinian and had, I would imagine, a fairly solid seminary education, so he should have known that that wasn't true. But they put that noble child, the Mother Mary, right into the place of Christ. They fashioned Christ into a judge, and thus devised a tyrant for anguished consciences, so that all comfort and confidence was transferred from Christ to Mary. And then everyone turned from Christ to this particular saint. Can anyone deny this? Is it not true? I'll deny it because it isn't true. And actually, I would then point out, doing a little bit of forensic psychology 500 years later, that when he talks about that, about how we fashion Christ into a judge, and then we have to have Mary to kind of soften up our approach to him or whatever, that's Luther's own, like, really sensitive conscience speaking. That Luther's issue was not actually primarily originally theological. It was something within him. That he was intensely scrupulous. He thought everything was a sin. He could never be cleansed of his sins. He went to confession constantly. If we were to diagnose him now, he probably was obsessive compulsive. There are some who think he had some form of autism. And so what he's saying here, the most important thing about what he said here, is that about Christ being turned into this tyrant and judge, because that was how he viewed Christ. That wasn't how the church did, necessarily, always anyway. Obviously we do at times, because that's true. Go read the text of the Requiem Mass if you want to see that. But that's Luther's sort of like overactive conscience talking. And so then he's sort of projecting that onto the church and using that as the basis of his objection. And I would argue that just about, if the church is what she says she is, if the church is the church founded by Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is God who can neither deceive nor be deceived, and everything that the church teaches is true, then it is actually impossible to have a theological objection to anything the church teaches. You can have all kinds of personal objections to it, but it's the difference between saying that you, it's an extension of what I'll say quite often in talking about like the existence of God and things like that, that it is actually impossible to be an atheist. Because you can say, I don't believe in God, but that's a statement about yourself. You can't say there is no God, because the only being who could theoretically have the requisite knowledge to conclude that there was no God would be God himself. Only God could know enough about the universe to have searched the whole thing and not found God there, and that's just absurd. And so you can say you don't believe in God. You can even say that given the way the world is put together, I'm not certain that it all points to God. But you cannot actually make the statement about reality that there is no God on the off chance that there's a stone that you have left unturned. And there is a stone you've left unturned, and that's usually the non-physical aspects of reality. So anyway, so there again, so I think that Luther's Reformation and Luther's sort of whole project grows out of this inability to reform himself. But that's my commentary here. And you can read a lot of the other things. This is among the nastier things that he writes. And he writes a lot of things like that, and you get the sense this was a man of intense anguish. And a lot of what he was doing was not objective, and it was not grounded in good theology. And the fact that he, shortly after kind of breaking with the church, forsakes his vows as a religious too, and gets married to someone who also forsook her vows as a religious, I think points to something very, very broken about Luther. So, one of the most influential people in human history, and I will leave that statement at that. The distinction here, so Luther does say, he speaks very warmly of Mary. He speaks of the Magnificat being very important. It's still part of Lutheran liturgical life. Luther promoted what we might call a passive Mariology, while Catholics have an active one. So Luther is teaching that honor is due to Mary given her role, but that we also can't. So we sort of acknowledge Mary as being an important sort of player in all of this, but ultimately all honor is deferred to Jesus, and it's difficult for me to get those words out because we also would say all honor goes to Jesus, but we honor Jesus by honoring Mary. We actively venerate and honor Mary because, as we say in the Divine Praises, blessed be God and his angels and his saints. That God is blessed, he is spoken well of. That's what a blessing is. Benedicere is to speak well. God is blessed when we bless the saints, because we're not saying this person is great because they're great. We're saying this person is great because the power of God worked in them. And how true of that is, that's not more true of anybody than it is of Mary. Given the extraordinary graces that she was given, and the extraordinary position in salvation history she was given. St. Peter Canisius, who was a Jesuit, Lord have mercy, writes a major response to Luther and his defense of Mariology at the time. 2 days ago, I got up in the AMBO and I talked about how there were 3, possibly 4 different sets of liturgical texts I could have used on that day, because on the 17th of September, it's the feast of, historically, until 1969, when it was taken out of the general calendar, was the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis. So I could theoretically I said it's a weekday in ordinary time, so that's one thing I could have done. I could have done a votive mass of St. Francis in honor of the Stigmata, with apologies to the Franciscans. At that point, Sister Kathy had walked in, and I said in particular to Sister Kathy, we're not going to do the Stigmata today. It's the feast of St. Robert Bellarmine, but with apologies to the Jesuits, though I am not usually inclined to apologize to the Jesuits. We weren't celebrating him either. It's also the feast of St. Hildegard von Bingen, who was an 11th century Benedictine abbess, so guess who we celebrated. Anyway, Peter Canisius wrote a series of catechisms to kind of answer some of what was being said at the time, and he talks about a practical rationale for Marian devotion. Marian devotion leads us to Christ. He sees the Hail Mary as the kind of most important Marian prayer. So by the 16th century, the Hail Mary is in wide currency. And why wouldn't it be? Because I would argue that it is, if you want to say that there's any Marian prayer more ancient than the Sumptuum Praesidium, it is the Hail Mary, because the Hail Mary is taken largely from Luke's Gospel. And he sees that then as the basis of Catholic Marian devotion. So just as the Catechism of the Catholic Church now, in its section on prayer, will go through the Our Father line by line and kind of tell you how it's meant to be just this little compact summary of how to pray. The Hail Mary represents kind of how do we have Marian devotion? Like, what is Marian devotion? It is to honor Mary. It is to ask her intercession. It is to acknowledge her place in salvation history. And that's really all we do in that prayer. So, any questions before we conclude? We have concluded. Is there anything else to say?
What would you say are the major differences between how the East approaches Mary versus the West?
I think at the end of the day, just like with anything else, the differences are largely in practice. Because on the one hand, like, you know, the rosary becomes sort of the staple of our Marian devotion. That there can be different sort of localized devotions, different images, even different kinds of prayers. But the rosary is going to be one of those that's kind of universal. That you can go to any state in the country, you can go to any country on earth that you find Catholics anywhere, they're all praying the rosary. And they might even have a little different local and regional variations, but it's one of those things that again sort of becomes universal. I think in the East, the locus of more of their devotion is on the liturgy, because the liturgy is more foundational to Eastern sort of praxis and outlook in general. So there actually is it's a lovely, I say it's a lovely little book, but it isn't really a book. It was written, I think, for somebody's master's thesis that they self-published on Amazon, but it's called Today the Virgin is Present in the Church. And it's actually a Byzantine Marian Byzantine Marian liturgical spirituality. And it's just a little capsule sort of summary of like what does Byzantine Marian devotion look like, and the answer is how does Mary show up in the liturgy. So I think it's going to be more focused on that, but there are other things like the Akathist hymn, which is in a lot of like kind of devotional prayer books that people will have. In the Slavic tradition, and this is really popularized by St. Seraphim of Sarov in the 18th century, he has what's called the prayer rule of the Theotokos, which is basically the rosary. It's just like a Russian Orthodox version of the rosary. The biggest thing, of course, I think in kind of people's homes and kind of everyday life is going to be icons. That there's probably not an Orthodox home that doesn't have an image of Mary in it. So I think that's kind of going to be, again, it's going to be more centered on the liturgy because just their life in general is. And a lot of that is due to the fact that like for us, where the monastic life is where we find the divine office. The monks and the clergy is the divine office. Devotional prayer grows up among the people to kind of cover where the divine office was sort of kept to that part of the church more or less for most of our history. And in the East, though, because the Eucharistic liturgy is only reserved for the most important of occasions, so they don't have daily mass in the Byzantine tradition by and large. The Ruthenians do, but the Ruthenians are sort of a special case in many, many ways. If my Ukrainian priest friend were sitting here and I said that, he would snort and laugh at that statement. But the divine office becomes the staple of parish liturgical life. That you would go to if you went to the church during the week for a weekday service, it's going to be Vespers. It's not going to be a Eucharistic liturgy. During Lent, they will do pre-sanctified liturgies where it's basically Vespers with communion. But even still, like daily mass is not a thing. So most sort of devotion for Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faithful looks more like going to church to pray the divine office. Whereas for us, we kind of, the divine office gets put kind of in the monastic silo for much of our history and isn't really as influential on the life of the kind of the everyday faithful.
It's just, I have a lot of Orthodox friends, and it's interesting hearing their perspective on things, because in one sense it seems as if they celebrate more Marian feast days, such as recently the Nativity of the Virgin.
Right, which we do too.
Yeah, but falling on a Sunday,
right,
they celebrate it as
right,
a
right.
feast, whereas we don't.
Right.
And I don't know, is that something about the modern church, or?
I think it's more to do with, well, there is an element of that because we don't, since 1969, we don't do commemorations.
Yeah.
You do commemorations during Lent, and even then they weren't done the same way they were done in the Old Missal. But also, so like they even have it so that every so often, like the Annunciation falls in Good Friday, and they don't have sort of a table of precedence. Like for us, if that happens, we just kick the Annunciation to like the Monday of the week after Easter, or the week after Easter, really the second week of Easter, they don't do that. You have, both of them are important enough that they have to both be celebrated. So I know somebody who was Ukrainian Catholic, who their church had to produce all these worship dates for when that happened. And the next time it's going to happen is in something like 355 years or something. So he said we stored all of those assiduously in the attic so that 3.5 centuries from now, our descendants can have those booklets, assuming that they still speak, postmodern English. But yeah, so that's actually, I think, less to do with sort of Marian devotion and just in general how we handle feasts versus how they do. And the modern calendar, I think that's just sort of an accident of that, because we don't do commemorations and things. In the old rite, if you go to a Latin mass on that Sunday, the 8th, I believe the Nativity of Mary would have been commemorated, because it ranks high enough that it can be commemorated, but not high enough that it overtakes Sunday.
I was just a little disappointed.
Yeah.
I didn't get to celebrate Mary's birthday.
Yeah. Well, this year, another one, the Immaculate Conception this year falls on Sunday, but it's a Sunday during Advent, because Advent's a privileged season, it gets kicked to the next day.
Yeah.
And it isn't a holy day of obligation because of that great principle of American Catholicism that says, God forbid you go to church on 2 days that touch each other, because that's very, very dangerous and it might be harmful to your health. So, all right, well, thank you all. Next week, we will talk about more recent phenomena. We will talk about the various modern devotions like the miraculous medal.